This video will only cover the differences between the first two Dune Imperium games base game only. I'll sprinkle my thoughts on them throughout and answer the rather controversial question of is this a cash grab? If you're not familiar with the first game, I would recommend you check out my other video of the original game first for a general overview of the rules. I've also compiled the information of every single card from both games into this Excel sheet as much as I could so I can compare the data and tell you some differences you might not know at the end. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Dune Imperium Uprising, which I'll refer to as just Uprising from this point on, is a standalone second game in the Dune Imperium line. Uprising borrows basically everything from the first game and changed a few things in it. They are so close in fact that this is basically just a remake of the first game. The first change is the addition of Spies. Nope, not that one, this one. A spy. Spies have their own mini dedicated spots like so that affects other nearby worker spots that are connected to it. Just like worker spots, each one of these spots could only be occupied by one spy. Though to place a spy, you would need to activate this symbol from either the cards or this worker spot. Each spy lets you do one of these two things. One, it lets you place your worker to a spot already occupied by other players' workers, or two, it lets you draw an additional card on top of the spot's effects. These spies are one use, so you'll have to take them back after you have done one of these two things. These are the default two uses of the spies, but there are some card effects that lets you get more things from the spies. Also, some cards will now have this spy location symbol, which corresponds to all the worker spots that are connected to your spies. Spies are probably the best change in the list as it provides more versatility and choices in the game. My only concern here is that there is only one worker space that lets you place a spy on the board, and it also happens to be an alliance spot. You know, it just seems very limited. Looking at my data, out of the 69 Imperium cards, only 15 of them lets you place a spy. And if you exclude the ones that only gives it to you one time from the acquire bonus, and the conditional ones like this card, you are only left with 10 cards, which does not seem like a lot. The numbers from the intrigue and conflict cards are honestly not worth mentioning either, plus they are one use and almost all of them are conditional. Seeing these numbers, you are bound to have games where you barely get to put your spies down. Though I guess if you really like them, you could just use one of these leaders with a spy special ability. Up next, we have the addition of Sandworms as a battle unit. And yes, they absolutely look like dick and balls. Hands down the best miniature in the hobby. This video could really just end here cause, I mean, do you need any more convincing? Oh, and an honorable mention to Earth's quote-unquote canopies too, by the way. Man, they must be having a good giggle when designing these things, huh? What was I talking about? In terms of strength during the conflict phase, a sword is worth 1 strength each, cubes are 2, and worms are 3. And if you have at least 1 worm in a conflict, all the rewards that you win in that conflict will be doubled. Though there are a few rather clunky rules you have to follow to get these worms. First, you need to have this maker hook, which you can obtain from this spot here with this symbol on the board. This allows you to always do transactions involving worms, as seen on these worker spots on the board. Some conflicts though does not allow you to summon worms as depicted by this symbol. Thematically, these conflicts take place in this area that is protected from these sandworms by this shield wall. Although, this shield wall can be destroyed when you go to a space with this break wall symbol. And when the barrier is removed, the worms are no longer restricted for the rest of the game for everyone. These worms are definitely the most controversial change in this game. Thanks to the double rewards, we went from getting at max 2 points from a single conflict in the previous game to getting a whopping 5 points in Uprising. 2 from here, 2 from this transaction, and 1 from this objective. Objectives, by the way, are these new symbols added to the conflict cards. In Uprising, whenever you win a conflict, you now also get to keep the conflict card itself. When you get 2 cards with matching symbols, you will instantly get 1 point. This is the reason why some conflict cards has objectively worse first place rewards compared to its second place reward. Also, no, this symbol does not get doubled by the worms. Oh, and you also start the game with a card that has one of these symbols. Anyways, getting 5 points from just one conflict seems kinda ridiculous in a 10-pointer game, so I dug a bit deeper. There are 5 conflict cards in Uprising that can give you a lot of points when doubled. 1 from this level 2 conflict and all 4 of the level 3 conflicts. Though out of the 5, this one can only give you a max of 4 points because you literally only have 3 physical spies, so you will never be able to do this transaction twice. Therefore, this conflict will not give you the max amount of points. These 2 cards on the other hand can give you 5 points, but it's pretty unlikely due to the amount of setup you would need on the faction tracks, which makes them rather unreliable. Though I gotta say, it's pretty insane that a level 2 conflict could give you 5 points. And so, we are left with these last two conflicts. Both of them can give us 5 points, and collecting these resources are a lot easier than setting up on the faction tracks. However, there still are quite a few requirements that you need to fulfill to get the 5 points. 1. You need to have 8 spices or 12 solaris on standby. These are a lot of resources that you'll have to accumulate over multiple turns. The spice one in particular is also conflicting with your goal because you cannot use them to go to these spots to boost your strength. Number 2, you have to break the barrier for the worms to be playable. Number 3, you need to have at least one sandworm in the conflict and therefore a maker hook as well. And finally, number 4, you need to match the objectives. While all of these requirements tell us that this isn't actually as swingy as you think, getting 5 points from just one conflict is actually massive. To put this into perspective, in the previous game, you would need to win at least 3 conflicts to get 5 points, 2 of which are level 3 and 1 level 2. So, do these two things balance each other out? I honestly don't know the answer. But one thing for sure, getting 5 points this way takes a lot of preparation and is actually quite risky, so no one's ever gonna just stumble their way into getting 5 points. Up next, we have the Choam Module. The module comes with these contract tiles, where 2 of them are always revealed on the board like so. You get to take one of these tiles when you go to a spot with this contract symbol. Most of these tiles correspond to a worker spot on the board and will give you a one-time reward for using that spot. They might instead require you to get a number of spices, get the Spice Must Flow card, or just straight up gives you coins for free. Some of the cards from the module also lets you get points depending on how many contracts you have completed. The module to me honestly feels rather underwhelming. Unless you've got one of these cards that helps you get or convert the contracts, you're basically consuming one full turn to get a contract, which doesn't feel that great. There's also barely any of these cards in the deck. Sure, you can stack contracts that have the same worker spot, but this is very much luck of the draw stuff and is unlikely to happen. Okay, now let's talk about the big changes in the new board. First off, the Fold Space card is now completely gone, so this spot that used to give you one of them has now been changed like so. I honestly have never been a fan of the card, so this change doesn't bother me at all. Plus, this spy mechanic sort of compensated for this anyway. The Mentat worker is also gone and is replaced by a spot that allows you to take a worker back instead. And you can only use the spot when you're at least 2 notches up in the Emperor track. Speaking of which, there are now 3 spots that have similar requirements with different guilds, while there was only this one in the previous game. If you're wondering where the same spot is for the 4th faction, well, there isn't any. However, the new static market card in this game has a draw bonus if you have 2 influence in that faction. I like these changes quite a bit because they make each faction a bit more unique. There is now something more to look out for other than just points on the tracks. Moving on, the High Council now has a second function that only becomes available after you've done its first action, which remains unchanged. This way, the spot doesn't just become dead after your first go. The extra worker spot has also been tweaked, where only the first player to obtain their extra worker has to pay 8 solari. Anyone else getting it after only needs to pay 6 instead. Still my least favorite spot in the game by far, because anything that gives you extra workers and therefore extra actions in a worker placement game is usually always an obvious rush. At least they have balanced the spot a bit more, but I still would rather just have it completely gone. Lastly, the game board gives you less solaris in general, while there are more interesting ways for you to spend them. This addresses the problem that I have in the first game, where solaris tend to feel a bit useless late game, unless you got the cards that let you trade them to points like this. Last but not least, let's compare the cards from both games. To start off, here's how many cards there are in each game, and here's how many unique cards are in each deck. Apart from the combat cards, Uprising generally has more total cards and unique cards. And speaking of unique cards, no card has been carried over from the first game. Yes, you're getting completely new unique cards with brand new illustration art on them. There are a few similarities between some cards, but that's just bound to happen. Here's a graph of card cost versus the number of Imperium cards in both games. As you can see, the distribution is very similar, with mostly around 1 to 2 cards difference for each card cost. A similar trend could also be seen for the total worker locations on these cards. Although, when it comes to the cards factions, there are considerably more Fremen, Spacing Guild, and Emperor ones. This makes sense because the new static card in Uprising has a Bene Gesserit faction. Speaking of the factions, based on the number of appearance of these symbols on the Imperium cards, the first game has an even distribution of these symbols, including for this wild one that lets you choose. But in Uprising, they mostly let you choose instead. There's also this new mechanic in Uprising's cards that requires you to discard other cards in your hand for more benefits. There are also way less Take That Imperium cards in Uprising, and yes, this is literally the only one. Whereas in the first game, there are 6 cards in total. This next one is probably rather subjective, but buying the low cost cards in Uprising feels a lot less like a trap compared to the first game. The cost 2 ones in particular feels a lot more useful, while the cost 1 ones honestly still have some questionable cards. Moving on, some of the conflict cards in Uprising gives you troops as rewards, which does not happen in the first game. Here are also some changes on the amount of Imperium cards that give you certain effects/resources. As you can see, there are more Imperium cards that can give you extra draws, intrigue cards, and water resource, while the rest of the effects/resources are approximately the same. Oh, and there are 9 new leaders in this game, and these 2 are by far the most unique ones. This one starts off pretty normal, but once you use its ability, it flips over to the other side, practically granting you a new ability and character. This one, on the other hand, will remove the diplomacy card from your starting deck. All in all, Uprising is basically Dune Imperium 2.0. It is the same game, just better in almost every single way. The rulebook says that you can combine the intrigue and Imperium cards from the previous game, but not the conflict cards. I personally would refrain from adding anything at all, because you are bound to upset a variable or two. Here's the easiest one. The more you add anything from the first game, the more that you also dilute anything new that is not in the first game. And lastly, as for the question of is this a cash grab, I'm personally leaning towards yes for this. To be fair, there is a lot of new content in Uprising. You're getting completely new Imperium, intrigue, and conflict cards, along with new and actually good mechanics in-game. These are much more content than what an expansion normally gives. However, this is absolutely the same game just done better, and it will 100% make the first game obsolete. They'll probably say that the upcoming Uprising expansions can be combined with the first game, but you and I know that Uprising will be the focus and the first game will be the afterthought. If you're wondering why I have not mentioned the 6-player mode at all, I'll be very honest and say that I have not played it. But before I tell you why, here's a very surface level explanation of the mode. The 6-player mode is actually a cooperative 3 versus 3, where you sit in a way that will alternate turns between the teams. 2 of these players will be the commander of each team. The 2 commanders play a bit differently compared to the other 4 players. Commanders do not enter the conflict and could not go up the board's faction tracks, so any resource that is useless to them, like these troops, would instead be given to one of their teammates. Combats are still done individually, so you could have 2 people from the same team winning first and second reward. Everyone also scores individually, but points are totaled at the end for each team to determine the winning team. As much as I like Uprising, a 6-player version of the game with 0 simultaneous action mechanic really sounds like a downtime nightmare. Plus, I'm also not a big fan of co-op games. A friend of mine told me that his 6-player game lasted around twice as long as a 4-player game, and that there's basically no reason to play the 6-player game ever. I personally feel that the 4-player game is already sometimes a bit too long, so sorry that I cannot give you a first-hand report of the 6-player mode. Anyways, hope you enjoyed this video. Check out my channel for more videos like this and leave a comment down below. I was actually going to make this video really short, like 6 minutes short, and look what happened.